The innovator attacks traditional values, the Tao, in defense of what he at first supposes to be, in some special sense, rational or biological values. But as we have seen, all the values which he uses in attacking the Tao, and even the claims to be substituting for it, are themselves derived from the Tao. If the Tao fails, all his own conceptions of value fall with it. Not one of them can claim any authority other than that of the Tao. Only by such shreds of the Tao as he has inherited is he enabled even to attack it. This is Pints with Jack, Season 9, Episode 17. The Abolition of Man, Chapter 2, Review. After Hours with Dr. Joshua Herring.
Have you been looking everywhere, searching for a place where you belong? Away from the masses, among clinking glasses, where the hearth fire is on. Let the laughter welcome you in, that eagle and child din. There's room at this table, so take a seat and tuck right in. For Pints with Jack. Pints with Jack.
Welcome friends to Pints with Jack. This month we've completed the reading of The Abolition of Man, Chapter 2. As I've said many times, this book is quite dense, and so, like last month with Chapter 1, today we're going to have a review of Chapter 2. And guiding us along the way today is Dr. Joshua Herring. Dr. Herring is a former guest of the show. He is Professor of Classical Education and Humanities at Thales College in Wake Forest, North Carolina, where he teaches liberal arts courses and directs the Certificate in Classical Education Philosophy program. He hosts the Optimistic Curmudgeon podcast and is the author of the forthcoming book, Sons of Adam, Daughters of Eve, C.S. Lewis's Images of Gender. Dr. Joshua Herring, welcome back to Pints with Jack.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here with you.
Now, you're a very busy chap. I've seen you've already done a live stream today, so please tell the listeners what you've been up to since you were last on the show.
My goodness. So there's a lot going on I probably can't say too much about, but there's exciting things behind the scenes. What I can say is that in terms of my teaching, I got to teach a great books class last semester for Thales College that was starting at the Renaissance and going up through the present. We managed to work in books 1 and 3 of The Fairy Queen and Till We Have Faces, and even a bit of T.S. Eliot. And it was just delightful to read those works with students. I've got 5 students who are now preparing to go into teaching careers from Thales College, which is very exciting. And I've been watching the classical education movement just seem to grow by leaps and bounds. We've got school choice happening everywhere. In the United States, there were sad developments in the UK with their tax law changing and the King Alfred School having to close their doors. So I've been following their story, but then looking at growth in classical education happening in Brazil and Australia and even Portugal. If you happen to know any Catholics who are on board with Montessori education, there is this absolutely beautiful sounding head of school position for a Catholic Montessori classical school that's opening on the coast of Portugal.
I could do that move. Wisconsin has very cold winters. That might work.
You know, I imagine if you told your wife that it came with a seaside villa, she might be on board with thinking about a move. Then we could talk about how you could become a head of school, David. But there's been a lot of things. My book has been on a hiatus, but God is good, and it looks like that hiatus may be over soon, but that's still I'm still sticking with the words of Aslan. I call all time soon, but soon my book should be out, hopefully. So lots of good things happening, and lots of occasions to read good books with students and to think seriously about important things.
Well, I am out of alcohol, and my 6-month-old and my 2-year-old have decided to become nocturnal, so I have already gone well past my allowance of caffeine for the day. So I've switched to chrysanthemum tea, which I think is very appropriate considering we're talking about the Tao. How about yourself?
Well, it is Friday afternoon, and I am officially finished for the day as far as like the work stuff goes. So I am sipping Woodford Reserve bourbon today. And you guys have moved. You've got the non-alcoholic trend going with Matt of recently. So I've never met Matt. I'd like to give him just a little bit of grief not having met him, but like, man, you're gonna drink beer. I don't understand why you would drink non-alcoholic beer. Just go one way or the other.
Either hot or cold, otherwise I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. Yes. Well, with your alcoholic beverage and my non-alcoholic beverage, I would like to toast our new patron supporter, Jessica Van Hoy. And since we're talking about the way today, I thought as a toast, I would read a few lines from a poem by St. John Henry Newman, and some listeners might know this as the hymn. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. The night is dark, and I am far from home, lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet, I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. So Jessica, may you always stay close to the way. Cheers.
Cheers.
Well, first of all, preliminaries. What's your own history with the abolition of man?
I was thinking about that earlier today when I looked at this question. I was trying to remember when I first read this, and I don't really remember when. I remember having read it at some point during my years at Hillsdale College, because the first year I was teaching at Thales Academy, I was asked to put together a talk about classical education for a teacher conference, and I drew on the abolition of man. That would have been sometime during the academic year 2013, 2014. Since then, it's one of those texts I've come back to about every 2 to 3 years. And in more recent years, I've taught this one to probably somewhere between 50 and 70 adults, because it's part of the first course that we teach in the Certificate in Classical Education Philosophy. That class is all about building a vision of philosophical anthropology that aligns with the Western tradition. And I find Lewis is great for introducing people to what he thought was what everyone knew, because of course, Plato, what do they teach them in these schools? It's all in Plato. Except the problem today is that very few people read Plato, and those who do rarely make it to book 5, where you get this description of the way the head, the chest, and the stomach work within this vision of the soul and vision of Plato's Republic. And so that's been a great way to introduce people to the traditional ideas of human nature. So that's probably the way I've become most familiar with it in recent years. But it played a decent part in my dissertation. I was and that section was published in Zen Zook's 80th anniversary of the Abolition of Man edition. Because what Lewis develops, and part of what I assume we'll get to today, what he develops with the Tao is this really interesting argument about morality. And I argue that the same kind of argument extends to gender. That gender is something you have to begin with as a premise. You can't reach it as a conclusion. And that it's part of this vision of moral basic knowledge that Lewis presumes.
Mm-hmm. I do find it funny that you wrote an 80th anniversary article. I actually think pretty much everyone I know was asked to do it by someone. Mine was in the Catholic Answers magazine. Yours was in Zenzooked. It's always nice when an anniversary comes and it actually forces you to reread an old book, because I hadn't read it since I just moved to San Diego. I remember finishing it. I went to a curry house and finished the final chapter, and was utterly confused, and then turned the next page to the appendix and went, oh, I should have looked at this. This makes much more sense. But we'll get back to that appendix today, I think, because we haven't spoken about it too much so far on the podcast. But let's start at a high level. As we've been working through abolition, each episode I've been providing a summary of the arguments so far, so listeners can remind themselves and track where Lewis is at. So how would you summarize chapter 2 as a whole, and what would you say is its core argument?
So I think Lewis is definitely building on what he's already done in chapter 1. He closed chapter 1 with that zinger line about we're going to castrate the geldings and then bid them be fruitful. And then he opens chapter 2 really going back to the themes of subjectivity and objectivity. And over the course of chapter 2, he's really going to build an argument for objective moral knowledge. And in doing that, Lewis is making the argument that there are, in fact, objective laws of morality. And they are laws that are perceivable, but they are laws that you have to start from. You can't get there by reason alone. You can accept them and believe them, and then you will see that they are true as you practice them in your life. But if you start from a position of kind of pure neutrality, you won't get there. You won't get to them. And I'm going to borrow a note from your argument, David, and just use one of the principles from the appendix to illustrate. I'll just use the law of special beneficence. It's his second law in the appendix as illustration. And by this, Lewis means the idea that every person ought to have a special kindness and special concern for those who are nearest to him. Now, he's following the law of general beneficence. There's a kind of general charity that we have for all people, but the closer people are to us, our own parents, our own children, our own siblings, our own students, our own community, are the people who attend our particular churches, the people who live in our neighborhoods, our towns, our counties. We owe a specific duty, Lewis argues, to them. Now, what Lewis is then going to go on to do is to say that this collection of moral knowledge, he's going to call it the Tao. I know we'll talk about why he picks that name here in a minute, but he names it the Tao, which is unusual for folks who are kind of steeped in ethics. This same kind of tradition has already been named. Lewis is not innovating with this. He's not an innovator in that sense. He's taking the natural law tradition and he's renaming it. He's saying there are these moral laws that if you think about it carefully, you'll see that this is true. And he's arguing then that every ancient culture agreed on a few of these moral premises. And that when you look back to antiquity, you can see that the Confucians in China, the followers of the laws of Manu in ancient India, those who obeyed Hammurabi's code in ancient Babylon, and the followers of the Ten Commandments and their more practical outworkings in Levitical and Deuteronomic legal discussion, are all saying some of the same things. Now, there are distinctions among each of those that scholars of antiquity can get into. But if you were to look at all of them, they all have certain principles in common, like you owe a special responsibility for your own children that not everyone else has. And Lewis believes that it's not the case that each of these cultures is creating the exact same laws through their ability to create positive law. Instead, these laws have to exist outside of each of these cultures. And that's his reason for saying these things are objective. They're not subjective to a particular culture or a particular individual. It's not the case that Solon just woke up one morning and wrote, I have received the insight. Every child should respect his father. Well, no, actually, that's something that is true of all cultures, and every ancient culture had laws about what would happen to a child who would strike his father, usually involving cutting off the offending hand. They saw that because it's baked into the moral structure of reality. So this then becomes, to tie this back to chapter 1, I think this is Lewis's argument that the man without a chest has been stripped away. He's been cut. His access to this moral law has been cut off through his miseducation. And what instead the man with a chest ought to have is a right education that is orienting him to search for these moral truths and is passing them on to him as a tradition that he's supposed to inherit. And by the end of chapter 2, Lewis has made this argument then that there's no other source of value, and anyone else who is claiming to have found a new source of value is actually lying and has some ulterior motive in play. And he's either just picking a couple of the pieces of the Tao out and isolating them in sort of an ideological way, or he is trying to innovate, and in that innovation, he actually loses the ability to summon people to die for some good. And so Lewis thinks that there is one and only one source of moral authority, and it is this tradition of thought he's calling the Tao.
See, I knew you were the right guy to have for this chapter. This is great. This is a whole lot of clarifications on what myself and my co-hosts have been trying to sort of pick apart and explain and wrestle with ourselves. I think this is providing some really wonderful clarity. So let's keep this truck and look at one of the first things Lewis says in this chapter, namely that the practical result of education in the spirit of the Green Book from Gaius and Titius must be the destruction of the society which accepts it. And when we did the episode on this, we breezed through that fairly quickly, and we never really tried to justify it. How do you think Lewis would defend that claim if somebody went, no, they won't?
Well, it's always dangerous to think about like what would Lewis say. I mean, if because in one sense he said exactly what he said, and in this, I think that line is one place where you could unpack that and prove that in 1,000 different ways. In 1943, if we were to look at it in 2026, I think we'd look at it in kind of a different way that is still proving the point. Because when I was thinking about this question earlier, I'm teaching a class this semester called Virtuous Leadership in a Free Society. And right now we're reading a book by Robert Nisbet called The Quest for Community. Yesterday, we were looking at the primacy of the institution of the family for social cohesion. Nisbet's writing in 1953, not just a decade after Lewis writes Abolition of Man. And he's looking at the fact that already in 1953, society has changed such that there's no longer the same sort of social benefits and incentives attached to family formation, and seeing the family as really what every individual is inside of. And that already the family is starting to shift in practice. Now, I think if we bring that up to today, we start to see a very clear answer to your question about Lewis. Because I think basically Lewis, this is a place where Lewis was very prophetic. And Western civilization has essentially become that we're living in the world that fulfills this particular prophecy. I think if we look at the family and if we look at marriage, we see that really easily. Where today we're in a world where it's no longer a given that people will get married and will form families. It's no longer a given that the family is this interconnected relationship of people who all live together and want to continue living together. Instead, there's all kinds of pieces that are now seem to be options. In a word, the givenness of the family, the givenness of the Tao, if you will, is no longer quite as sure and certain as it once was. So today, it seems like there are options. All the rainbow flag collection of LGBTQ identities that don't lend themselves towards family formation. We've now got competing narratives of even what marriage is, where homosexual marriage does not lead to the natural creation of children and offspring in the same way. You've got all these kind of pieces that once were certain, and now in the world today, the Tao as the givenness of the moral reality is not certain in quite the same way. I think what Lewis is really getting at is that if we reject the Tao and if we reject the right moral formation that education is supposed to do, what we get is something different. And the problem with something different is that, as he puts it in Paralandra, you don't get the original good. You may very well get some harm instead. And I think that's really where we are today. I think that's where Lewis would say, well, actually, that practical assault is a rejection of those essential foundations that education is supposed to do. And in the long run, you eventually have a society that devours itself. And I think that's really where we are today. We've rejected those essential foundations, and we don't have those foundations with nearly as much certainty and as much primacy as we ought to. And that gives rise to all kinds of social ills today. These are the deaths of despair. This is the endless problems with birth rate and with concern about like why are young people not doing what they have done time out of mind, that is form couples and get married and have kids. Like that's just not happening in the same way. We in the 2020s, we live in a world that has actively cut away the very foundations that Lewis is talking about in the 1940s. And we live in a world where it's really difficult to actually tell somebody, here's how you ought to live and how you ought to feel, how you ought to aspire. We've almost cut away the ability to resonate with an ought.
What about the argument that it will lead to a different world? Certainly, but why destruction?
Yeah, well, I mean that's then the question. So this I think this is why Lewis is simultaneously very perplexing to people, and if they get what he's saying, he becomes quite offensive. Because what he's actually arguing is that the world is not constructivist. So This may be a little bit more educational philosophy than your audience is used to, but philosophy of education tends to fall into a couple of specific camps. There is the constructivist camp that argues knowledge is constructed through what we do. So we're always constructing knowledge through our activities. There's the perennialist camp that says there are certain truths that have been true time out of mind for all people, all places, and education is all about helping people encounter those perennial truths. Now, to take that dichotomy, the perennialist camp adheres to the givenness of reality, that we are given the world, and because we didn't make the world, we are limited in our ability to change it for the good. In fact, when we make changes, we're more likely to mess up what's been given to us than we are to actually come up with some new gain that no one else before us has ever thought of before. I would argue the predominant view in the world today is a constructivist view of reality, where actually people believe we are constructing the world around us and we can make it do whatever we say we can do. Now, this shows up in the practical world of politics as policy wonkery. I think is my favorite term for it, where policy folks decide, oh, we're just going to make a policy that decides that this is true. And one easy place to look at maybe on the economic side is modern monetary theory, which maybe is not where we were going to go with Lewis, but it's a good example. Modern monetary theory really asserts that fiscal policy is just completely made up based on the opinions of whoever's currently in charge. And we can just always print more money in order to solve our problems. Well, modern monetary theory for most economists is absolute nonsense because it ignores the reality of inflation. We felt the reality of inflation during COVID because economics is not constructed knowledge. In as much as economics is true, it's actually tapping into a real set of ideas that really do explain the way humans actually interact. And when we monkey with those ways that people actually interact, we actually mess it up. And so I think that's how I would apply the abolition of man to that response. Be like, well, yeah, you're going to end up with a different world, but you're messing up something really, really fundamental. One last example. I got this one first from a friend of mine named Katie Faust. She's the head of a nonprofit out in Seattle called Them Before Us. Her whole stock in trade is to argue that children have a natural right to a biological mother and a biological father. Now, she is herself the daughter of a lesbian married to a woman. So she says that with full knowledge of kind of how that hits homosexual couples that want children. And she argues that actually in the aftermath of Obergefell, we in America have profoundly messed up family formation. And we have ended up with something different. Where you can get, and what we've actually done is made it culturally permissible for homosexual couples to adopt children. That's one thing. I don't think anybody publicly said 10 years ago when Obergefell was first occurred that the goal was to incentivize the surrogacy industry to create children for purchase by homosexual couples. That's not a natural family. But it is an existing family model today because we've used the apparatus of positive human law to monkey with the givenness of the natural institutions of marriage and the family. And so, to your point, I would say, yes, a different thing has emerged. And so too have different harms that would not have emerged if we had never tried to mess with the givenness of the world.
Well, then moving on, is there actually such a thing as a subjectivist? And I ask this because Lewis points out in this chapter that despite what they say, the authors of the Green Book are trying to shape society in a particular way, which necessarily means they must think it good, at least in some sense. Good enough that they want their conception of the good spread.
So I think answering that depends entirely on what you mean by a subjectivist. So I'll always tell you what I think, but that may not help if you have a different understanding of subjectivist in view. So maybe we should start there. David, what do you mean by subjective?
That there isn't any objective truth, that my assertion about a certain subject is my opinion, And there is nothing about my opinion that means that another person ought to agree with me. It's like me saying, I like vanilla ice cream. You might like a different kind of ice cream, and that is perfectly acceptable. There's no reason I should tell you, no, you don't like strawberry ice cream. You should like vanilla ice cream.
Now, in that sense, I think Lewis at least is contending that there are not, Gaius and Titius certainly are not actually subjectivist in the sense of they're actually trying to, because they're trying to deny the actual existence of values. I think Lewis's point is that they can't. And if you deny the existence of the traditional values, what you get instead is the substitution of your personal whim, your personal preference. So to use your example, David, it's one thing if you say, there's no such thing as a best ice cream. I just happen to like vanilla. That's perhaps a reasonable position to hold. It's a whole nother thing if you're given all power and the ability to control the educational information of all children everywhere, and you then have the ability to sway people with what Lewis calls a perfect scientific and psychological method that he imagines these conditioners are one day going to have. Says, well, what would they do then? What they would do is they would replace these traditional values with their personal preferences. So in theory, in Lewis's thought experiment, you could imagine a future where you have the ability to pipe in the phrase, vanilla ice cream is the best, to every headset or AirPod worn by any child from birth through age 12. And then you further could have the ability to shape the economy such that the only flavor of ice cream available is vanilla ice cream. And I think Lewis's point is to say, well, you in a prior world, the world of the Tao, maybe there is no answer to what's the best flavor of ice cream. And when you replace the Tao with your personal preference, what you've actually done is enact a monstrous act of tyranny, where you've destroyed the ability of each person to cultivate his taste. And I think this is Lewis's larger ethics point, that inside the Tao, there's actually an immense amount of personal freedom. And that every attempt so far to replace the Tao with some other version of ethics actually ends up substituting some other form of tyranny, either some other person's tyranny, an individual enslaving himself to his desires because he does not rule his belly in any way.
Before we talk a little bit more about the Tao, why do you think he actually calls it the Tao? Because this is something that seems to trip up everybody when they first read it. And if ever I hand copies of The Abolition out to my friends, which I needlessly say do, I will give them a primer, just like, when you hear Tao, think natural law. Because most of my friends are Christian of some variety and have some basis in that sort of scholastic way of looking at the world. Why did he go with Tao?
Well, I think that's actually exactly what Lewis is wanting to fence off, and why he's, not to say you're wrong to give friends.
I'm subverting him.
Like, when you call something natural law, you almost immediately code it as a Catholic project. The Catholic intellectual tradition is where the natural law thinking really kind of flourished. I mean, it's older than that. It goes back to Rome. But Protestants did not really cultivate and grow natural law thinking. There's a few people who are trying to kind of revive that tradition on the Protestant side. But as soon as you call something, I'm going to give a natural law argument for X, you've already located your argument first inside Christianity and then even further inside Catholicism. I think for most people, that's the rhetorical effect.
And before you know it, Protestants are praying the rosary. Oh my goodness, the world's going to pieces.
Well, I'll just point out that as much as you interject those lines, Lewis never did cross the Tiber. We kept him on our side. I mean, it's
okay. He's Catholic now. He's Catholic now.
Well, we'll find out when we meet Lewis in eternity. That's for sure. But
actually, a little advert for next season. We're going to be looking at Lewis specifically as an Anglican. We're going to have at least one episode, probably two, on that.
Oh, anyway, there we go.
Please continue.
So I think that's the first thing I would say is that, I mean, he's looking for, because he says in this chapter that this argument does not depend on theism it does not depend on Christianity. I think he adds both of those pieces. He wants an argument that will apply natural law reasoning in a way that non-Christians and non-theists will find philosophically sophisticated. Because I think the context in which he's giving these lectures still matters a lot. This is not Lewis sitting down writing a book for mass consumption like Mere Christianity was. I mean, that was intended as that started as radio broadcast for the average Englishman. This was an invited philosophical lecture that I don't know if he received any honorarium or anything for it, but like this was an opportunity to shine. And one of the things I didn't know until I read the Journal of Inkling Studies supplement a couple years ago is that Lewis's first attempt at getting a job at Oxford was as a philosophy tutor. And he got a job in that field for 1 year, but they weren't hiring for any longer contracts. And there was a new thing on the horizon called an English department. And so it's almost to some extent, it's an accident of the hiring market that Lewis ended up as a career literary scholar. He had the mind and he had the credentials with a double first in greats and in philosophy that he could have been a philosopher. And I think this is him trying to kind of offer a term that will not immediately pigeonhole his arguments. At the same time, it's also worth noting there are not very many Taoists in 1940s England. Odds are very low that a lot of people had read Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. I mean, folks surely knew Confucius, but even not a ton of Confucian thought. So I think Lewis is just kind of pulling this unusual term for his audience. So that's my take on it, at least.
That makes sense. Now, Lewis describes various attempts in the chapter to replace the Tao. He offers utilitarianism, reason, and instinct. Would you mind just talking about one or two of these and why Lewis thinks they fail?
I'm going to start with instinct because that's the one I remember most fully. You might have to remind me of some of the parameters on the others. But he talks about instinct particularly as the explanation that people just do the moral thing. And he's talking about it with the specific example of dulce et decorum est and greater love hath no man. Will one die for his country? And which, in the context of World War II, is a necessary question. The draft was a big deal, and Lewis himself fought in World War I. He had answered his country's call in that war. So why go to war in the absence of patriotism if patriotism and defense of your home are both foolish sentiments? Well, Lewis posits that, in fact, one might argue, well, you just have an instinct to protect your progeny. And he argues that he observes no such instinct within himself. He doesn't have an instinct to care for children. He, in fact, says he does not really like children that much. He recognizes that as a personal fault. So he doesn't really find the instinct argument terribly persuasive. You said the other was utilitarianism, and what was the third one?
He calls it reason, and he makes a distinction between reason and what he calls practical reason.
If I remember correctly, I believe this is where the reason part is where he's dealing with the idea of premises versus conclusion.
The older idea of intellectus versus ratio, that some things you just perceive and other things you use Aristotelian logic to reason your way to.
Exactly. And he argues that the principles of ethical behavior have to be that sense of, I'm going to confuse the terms here, but it's that one that is just seen and perceived. It's not one that you're going to reason your way to, because if they don't start as premises, you don't reason your way to throwing yourself on the grenade to save your buddy's life. In fact, you reason your way into, well, if I save my own life, I can care for his family afterwards. It will be better for others that I live. You reason your way into the self-rationalization there is really palpable. Okay, so instinct and utilitarianism, I don't remember. So remind me how he deals with util. I don't remember.
Utilitarianism, I would say, is probably the one of the dominant spirits of our age. It's like, well, is it practical? And the question that Lewis asks is this: would practicality be a sufficient reason for me to be willing to lay down my life? The fact that it helps other people? Cool. Why am I the one that has to make the sacrifice? Or if you try to argue that, well, utilitarianism is the thing that makes us most happy, it's the maximum amount of happiness in the world. And it's like, cool for other people, I'll be dead. Now, you could try and pair that with a belief in the afterlife and blessing in the afterlife, but it still doesn't change the fact that I'm the one that has to offer the sacrifice, not somebody else.
I found the passage that he might say that the real value lay in the utility of such sacrifice to the community. Good, he might say, means what is useful to the community. But of course, the death of the community is not useful to the community, only the death of some of its members. What is really meant is the death of some men is useful to other men. I think that's a great response to the utilitarian argument there, in that he's almost decoding it, and I think that's one of my favorite ways to kind of handle general utilitarianism as a reasoning structure. It almost invariably has hidden assumptions behind it. A real utilitarian usually operates in the world of facts and figures. If we pass this tax, we will be able to fund this many projects, and Y number of people will in fact have more water access, and so on. But the hidden assumptions are always worth exploring. Is the tax actually going to have any downsides? What's the rate of corruption that's present in this endeavor? Do we even need more access to water, and so on? Utilitarianism tends to resist those broader questions. I think Lewis kind of peels that back for this particular one.
It kind of reminds me of Out of the Silent Planet when Ransom is translating for the Oyasa, that you have these very soaring speeches that are being offered about the greatness of humanity and being flung among the stars, and it basically has to be translated down into its raw meaning, which is like, we're going to go everywhere, we're going to kill everything and subjugate it, and we're just going to keep going. It doesn't sound quite so grand and noble when you reduce it to those terms. And it also makes it very clear what the cost is going to be, what the sacrifice is actually going to have to be offered, and by whom.
I think the broader question that Lewis is raising all these examples for is still, in the absence of a traditional set of values, where love for home and love for your country is a beginning point, how do you ask people to die for others? And he calls that particularly, he had a nice Latin phrase for this. He called it the experimentum crucis, which shows different systems of thought in the clearest light. He's not really trying to get at virtue or martyrdom, but he wants to use this as an extreme example to provoke us to realize, well, actually, what would it take to get someone to voluntarily join up to die in defense of home? And if I don't have a real love of home, I'm very unlikely to do that. And I think I think it's really illustrative.
So I'd now like to return to something that we mentioned earlier about a presupposition that's happening here with regards to the Tao. And I remember when I first read this sentence, I thought, is this a logical fallacy? Because Lewis says the principles of the Tao have to be our starting premises. They cannot be reasoned to as conclusions. And I'd always thought of the Christian worldview as one that was eminently rational and that you could reason largely to it. You might not be able to get to the Trinity, but you could get to the existence of the world, the existence of God, the existence of moral truth. So to say that we have to begin with the Tao as our starting premises, I wasn't sure if that could be justified. Isn't that sort of like the sharpshooter fallacy? It's like you shoot an arrow at a barn door and then you draw the target around it.
No, I don't think this really fits that particular kind of model of thought, because what Lewis is getting at with the idea of premises and conclusions is that there actually have to be, thought doesn't start from completely nothing. Instead, it builds on something. Maybe take small kids for an example. They don't actually learn language from nothing. They don't just get it from nowhere. Instead, they already have these given capacities of hearing and sight and speech, but they're learning language through their experiences and through the words that they hear spoken around them. And that it's just part of the beauty of the mind that the youngest ages, the mind is reaching for all these words. Like, well, I want as many words as possible. And then suddenly kids are talking. And there's like those, I think that's really what Lewis has in view, is the idea that your moral actions the idea of moral principles don't really start from nowhere. And so instead you have to take these as a given. And I think that's why the nature of the principles he outlines in the appendix are really important, because he's not drawing on very specific things. He's not there's from this book, there's not a tax code in the Tao. There's not a given sense of government in the Tao. Instead, there are these super broad principles. I already mentioned the laws of general and specific beneficence. He has 6 others. There are duties to parents, elders, and ancestors. If you don't start there, if you don't start with that as a presupposition that those above you are insisting on, you have a decent chance of not living very long. But B, I don't know that you will get there if you start like this is. I've had students who like they'll raise this question. Well, Mr. Herring, you've told me I need to respect my parents. Why? My parents are terrible. And in some cases, they can list some generally awful things, and I'm like, whew. But still, you have to respect your parents. That becomes, as for Lewis, that's a given. That's a foundation point. And if you don't have that foundation point, you can't go anywhere. He pairs that with duties to children and to posterity. That parents, after all, if I've already been a little spicy on your show, so I'll just keep it rolling. I mean, I was listening to a clip yesterday where Andrew Tate was asking the question, "Why should I get married? What does it do for me?"
Mm.
And like, well, what you could apply the same question to a child. Well, I have a kid. What does that kid do for me?
You're already presupposing the value system that is going to evaluate it. Namely, what does it do for me?
Yeah. But even asking the question already like tries to like, asking the question is already rejecting that like, no, if I have a child, I have some vested interest. I have a responsibility to care for that child. If I'm trying to like, well, okay, let me just set that aside and analyze this objectively with some definition of value and say, well, what does that kid do for me? Is it worth the 18 years of worry and aggravation? Maybe a better way to illustrate it is there's a really funny moment in Parks and Rec where Leslie has just told Ben that she's pregnant with triplets.
And I heard the spreadsheet laugh at me.
That's the one. It's like Ben's the accountant, and he's like, we can't do it. It will cost us $22 trillion to have 3 children and raise them to age 18. And Leslie's just like, don't worry about it, honey. We're going to figure it out. That's the kind of thing that I think Lewis has in view, that you're just like, if you were to stop and say, well, what's the rational case, the logical positivist case for this moral law, this moral duty, you really, you can't really build one. He does maybe another one. The law of justice, he subdivides into sexual justice, honesty, justice in court. So these 3 different levels. He quotes the 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, that's given here as a presupposition that's also present in the Old Norse society and the Babylonian society in different variations. Well, that starts as a given for Lewis. That's part of justice in this sexual domain to all people. But if you start with like, well, why? I'm going to treat that as like a possibility. I might keep my wedding vows or I might not. Now, for starters, you probably will never get married if that's your beginning point. But then there's also the like, well, no, you've totally misunderstood the nature of marriage and the nature of family and exactly where sex fits into it all and the duty you have to your neighbors if you don't just recognize the givenness of that as a moral responsibility. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that's an instance of Lewis just like defining a code of ethics and then saying, look, I've found the universal code and I've drawn my circle around it. Instead, it's him saying there are a few, not a huge number, but there are a few presuppositions that all good, rational human beings realize are true. And this becomes kind of the core of the educational task to bring the next generation into this. Lewis has this great line about education is old birds teaching young birds to fly. Well, part of that means there's a certain thing about being a bird. It means something. There are things birds eat. There are things birds do. There are things foxes do that birds don't do. And it's old birds who bring young birds into that tradition. Now, the young birds may very well ask, well, what are these wings for? Maybe these wings are for swimming. Maybe these wings are for digging. And it's the old bird that's like, no, 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 no. Your wings are for flying. Let me show you how. And I think that's what Lewis has in view with these laws of the Tao. These are essential principles for how to be a good human being that experienced human beings are supposed to bring young human beings into.
And that's not to say that you can't make a rational case for these things. I've often said if everyone kept the 10 Commandments, there would be far fewer problems in the world. There would be fewer broken families, fewer stuff would get stolen. It has all of these kinds of benefits. But to start from nothing to get to that, you still have to get an ought from somewhere. And as when he spoke about reason, you can't get an ought from an is. Just simply because that's the way it is doesn't mean that you should do it. You might even say that you like it or you think society is better in this way. But we really have to have a starting point that everyone can agree on that is, and I'm going to use this very particular word, self-evident. Because I don't know if you know, I'm now an American, and so I can now.
I was kind of excited when you were excited about being American. I'm like, all right, this is great.
Can't get rid of me now. But in the Declaration of Independence, it says we hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It takes that as a starting point. It doesn't try and argue for it. Because some of these things are actually kind of hard to argue for unless you have some presuppositions behind it. Even just that basic idea that all men are created equal. Well, they clearly aren't. Some people are better. Some people are smarter, better looking, better at sports. But, enough about me. It's very easy to imagine a society where that wasn't prized, where, no, we've taken to heart survival of the fittest. Men are clearly not made equal. Let's begin the eugenics project. And we're already in chapter 3 of The Abolition of Man.
I will try not to get into that territory. It only gets better. I mean,
or worse, depending on your point of view.
Well, I mean, part of this too is probably I'm just going to, hopefully this won't be too much of a spoiler, but I'm going to read the last line of chapter 3. Because I think it's relevant to this question of whether or not your moral precepts are a starting point or are they things that you have to get behind in order to justify. Before I read that, I did think of one other line that may be relevant here. I don't know if we know this for sure, but it's at least part of the general tradition that above Plato's Academy is supposed to be this line, "Let no man enter here who has not first mastered Euclid." And the reason for studying Euclid is that Euclid is a deep training in how to give a proof.
Yeah.
And so before you're prepared to study philosophy, you need to study as much as possible about the science and mathematics of shape and be able to prove that with logical rigor. After that, you're ready to enter the academy and the broad-ranging conversations that Plato is going to introduce. But if you haven't got Euclid as a foundation, you're not ready to understand the theory of the forms. And I think Lewis has something like that in mind with the Tao. It's like these principles they have to be held to first. And they could lead to all kinds of later adaptation and contextualization and derivative ideas that go from them. But if you start with saying, well, I don't know about any of these moral principles, I want to question everything, Lewis ends the book, the third lecture this way. A wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. You end up, if you question everything, you end up as the skeptic who knows nothing.
And as we've seen in the history of philosophy, that leads you to question everything, including your own existence. Can I even know I exist? Can I trust anything about my senses whatsoever? If you really do come to everything with a skeptical eye, you can't do a thing.
Yeah.
Now, Jack says that while he's a theist, he's actually not going to talk about the origin of the Tao. But I want to ask you, are there really any other options? I racked my brain, and maybe it's because I'm also a theist, but I really can't think of anything that could possibly explain this other than it's a brute fact. This is just the way the universe is.
Yeah. I don't think so. I too don't have any other option. I mean, I think it already seems an impossible leap of faith to me to think that evolution produced the complexity of the human eye. it seems even more impossible to say, oh, well, the moral fabric of the universe just evolved through material causality. Like that is just seems absolutely ludicrous. So I would take this as Lewis is again, he's being kind of coy. This is I'm thinking of Michael Ward's assertion that Lewis liked to hide puzzles and like to sometimes you got to read some of his stuff a little tongue in cheek. That line may be one of those because I just don't know where else you would ground morality. Immanuel Kant also tried to do a similar thing, but nobody reads Kant and really thinks Kant doesn't believe in God. Kant's God is just very logical.
It does seem like an exercise in translation. It's like, you're using these other terms. I think you just mean what Christians have always talked about.
I usually teach Kant as an Enlightenment project to essentially derive Christian morality without the Bible. And I think you get from Kant, it works quite well. His later disciple, John Rawls, it really starts to unravel pretty quickly. But that may be that's a conversation for another day, probably.
Well, as we're nearing the end, let's talk about what Lewis says regarding development within the Tao. He says it can happen organically and from within, but it can't be done from without and surgically. What do you make of that? Because as a Catholic, all I hear is development of doctrine. It's like, oh yeah, an acorn can grow into an oak tree, of course. But then you have the perennial question that the Protestant always brings up. How can you tell the difference between an organic change and a surgical change?
The answer to that, I think, is being within the Tao. And Lewis probably does have something akin to the Catholic idea of development of doctrine, but he's not here thinking doctrinally or theologically. He means this in terms of like the development of human wisdom, and the general tradition of Western knowledge is this big, broad field. I usually either teach this as a river or a tapestry. You're in the river. And in the river, you can feel all the pulls and the tensions, and you get to know the river. You feel every inch of this river, and you can know what's a violation of the river, and you can actually shift the river a little bit correctly if you know the nature of the river. I think that's what Lewis has in view. This is the key terms, I think, are from within or from without. Because he's still this is following his argument that the only possible basis for moral knowledge is from within the Tao. And he's still got in view these guys who are Gaius and Titius and their later descendants, the innovators and the conditioners, who are trying to consciously put themselves outside the Tao and then develop a new morality. And Lewis is arguing like, no, the only way what you're going to do that is you're going to destroy the river by trying to change it from outside, but from within you get an interior knowledge of the nature of the river that lets you know what it really is, and it lets you curate it. But there's something of a chronological element to this as well. As we're moving down time, each generation receives the Tao, and they each sort of curate it a little bit, and so. Let's take two changes. I've already mentioned Obergefell, so I'll just keep that one going. But then also let's think about William Wilberforce and convincing Parliament to abolish slavery in England. Well, Obergefell was a change from without. Justice Kennedy made the astounding legal judgment that love is love, and therefore homosexual union can be called marriage. That would be a change from without that ignores 6,000 years of recorded human history and the nature of marriage. It's an external change. It's done by fiat. I think there's just there's a qualitative difference between that kind of a change and William Wilberforce building a 30-year argument that, based on the nature of humanity, as first articulated in Genesis chapter 1, that all humans are made in the divine image, it is immoral for the British Empire to enslave human beings. We actually proclaim ourselves to be a Christian empire over here in the UK, the UK, it was the UK by the time Wilberforce was there. And as such, we ought not violate scripture through our economic practices. Therefore, we should abolish slavery. Now, it took a lifetime to convince enough people of that Parliament then decided to outlaw slavery. Now, that's a change from within. It's a change that says, okay, we're going to look at this whole tradition and we're going to say there are some parts of this that we think actually it's wrong based on the parts that we believe to be true, and we're going to make this change. And now that whole argument only makes sense if you accept the Tao.
Yeah.
If you don't accept the Tao, then those two are equal social changes. And that's where I think Lewis is, again, perplexing. But to those who understand him, he's either absolutely brilliant or he's incredibly offensive.
Well, then, to put a bow on all of this and wrap it up, what do you think are the practical applications of this chapter, particularly regarding education?
So one of the reasons I love this book is because I've spent the last 13 years, particularly in the world of classical education. And for classical education, we're all about forming the soul of the student to love what is worth loving and hate what is worth hating. And I don't mean to speak for a whole movement of 10,000 schools, but I think we're pretty unified on this point, that you can't really just tell kids what's right and what's wrong and compel them to be good. We can try, but what we actually are doing in the process of education is we're equipping students to fulfill their potential, and then we're constantly trying to draw them towards what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful. And we're doing that through exposure to the great tradition of literature and history and philosophy and art and music and science and math and language, the inheritance of the West. And so I think what Lewis is saying about the Tao is a great encapsulation of like, this is what we're trying to do. And it's one of the things that is both a beautiful part of classical ed, and it's also a huge problem area in a way. Because it's beautiful in the sense that it does give us a relatively clear understanding of what we're really trying to do. We really do want students to receive the Tao, to accept the Tao, to cherish the Tao, and to curate the Tao. And that does mean that we, the current generation of teachers, are submitting our work to the next generation to curate. They themselves will evaluate us and decide if what we did was worth passing on the next generation. The problem, this is a current problem in classical education, is that classical ed is growing so fast that there are a lot of people who want the results of classical education, but they don't see the connection to the Tao. And they really don't want the moral pieces that Lewis kind of draws out. They would love to keep this vague and ambiguous and say things like, we teach people how to think, not what to think, which is absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
So I think what Lewis really does here for education is just cast a strong vision that the educator is irrigating the desert of the student's heart. The educator is a channel of the Tao. The classical educator is himself the one who is transmitting this culture, this paideia, the Greeks called it, to the next generation. So this really, I take Abolition of Man as something of an educational manifesto. We're trying to put this into practice.
Kind of like an apostolic succession of objective value. Man, this has been a very Catholic-heavy episode.
No, if we take it that way, I can just say that anytime we classical educators mess up the Tao, it's just the wrong pope being in charge, and it's a schism.
Hey, when you've got 3 popes to choose from, you just choose the one you like best.
That's it.
Oh my goodness, that's too bad. Okay. Well, Dr. Herring, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people go to find out more about you and what you're up to?
I'm present on Facebook, LinkedIn, and X, all the old people social media platforms. Particularly on X, I tweet under my podcast name, so the Optimistic C3. So that's where you can find me. You'd also definitely check out the podcast. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, all the places. If you just search for the Optimistic Curmudgeon, you'll find the show.
Well, I hear the call for final drinks, so thanks again to Dr. Herring, to our stenographer Julia, our sound engineers Taylor and Sarah, all of our patron supporters, but particularly our top-tier supporters, Jacob, Alex, John, Ryan, Dan, Jody, Dave, Brian, Meg, Rebecca, Sarah, Mark, Kevin, Paul, Bud, James, Robert, Mark, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Shane, Becca, Paul, Gary, Stephen, John, James, Kate, Peter, Rowdy, David, and Angela. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. We pray for you every single time we release an episode. And if you've enjoyed this episode, wait until the next time Dr. Herring comes back to talk about his book. And please join us again then, when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers!
Cheers!